Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, January 24th. Well, we can say this, at least it hasn't been boring. On Monday, Donald J. Trump was sworn in as the 47th president of the United States, only the second person in history ever to return to office after having been defeated for re-election. And he's made his presence felt from the very moment he took the stage in what sounded more like a regime change announcement than a transfer of power. Trump used his inaugural address to declare his return a day of liberation. He then signed nearly 200 executive actions to put his own stamp on the government, on the country, and frankly, on the world. Many have been stunned, not least those watching from abroad. We'll take a look at the reaction of America's allies and adversaries in Europe and Asia to see how they have reacted to Trump's return to power. But Trump's return was not the main or the only news. On Sunday, Phase 1 of the Gaza ceasefire went into effect, silencing the guns for the first time in more than a year. Hostages and prisoners have started to be released. Aid has begun to flow into the Strip, and Gazans are moving back to their places where they used to, in many cases, have houses, but much of which is still in complete rubble. The big question everyone is asking, will this ceasefire become permanent, or will the war resume in little more than 5 weeks' time? Here to help us make sense of all these stories are three reporters who have covered them. Catherine Philp, World Affairs Editor of the Times of London, Prashant Rao, Senior Editor at Semaphore, and Ken Moriyasu, Washington Correspondent of Nikkei Asia. Good morning, good afternoon, Catherine, Prashant. Great to see you all. Prashant, let's start with you. No doubt that the big news this week, even though Prince Harry settled with Murdoch, I think the big news we can say was the inauguration of Donald Trump, his return to power. Remarkable from a historical perspective in every possible way that you can think about it, but probably even more remarkable is what he has done since he returned to office. You're in Europe, you're in London. What are people starting to say there as they look at these actions, and what are they starting to think?
Yeah, Ivo, I think you sort of put it in the correct historical context. It's not unprecedented, but it is, so the kinds of things we are seeing are so rare in history that it's really hard to take it all in at once, particularly given the absolute blizzard of executive orders that we've had to sort of parse through and understand, and that will no doubt be contested in courts and the legislative agenda. I think, the domestic politics of it is a separate issue. I think from here I'm based in London, and, a couple things that have been striking have been, I think the fact that he was inaugurated the week of Davos. I think since the World Economic Forum was founded, there's possibly been no American president who has more elementally challenged the Davos consensus of liberal internationalism and free trade. And so, all of my colleagues who've been at Davos have been saying that all of the attention has been trained across the Atlantic at what's been happening in DC. It does challenge that kind of global business consensus of, reducing borders, reducing trade frictions, all these kinds of things. I mean, he's already talked about tariffs on China, Canada, Mexico, possibly the European Union. And what's been striking has been the extent to which the Europeans, despite having had all this time to prepare and having had these 4 years of experience of Trump's first term, have seemingly been kind of caught off guard and still been scrambling as to what are the kind of policies and how do they respond. There's still a lot of talk about how Europe must prepare for tariffs, as though they're surprised that this would be a threat, that Europe has to kind of figure out how to deal with this. Macron and Schultz had a meeting this week, kind of still, I think, grappling with what the president's position on Ukraine might be. That's something I talk about later as well. And that has been kind of interesting to me. There are a few things that we have to sort of couch all of this in, right? And that are my memory, I'm sure yours too, from Trump's first term is what the president says is not necessarily American policy and does not necessarily follow through in concrete action. And so I think there is some calibration there from a foreign policy perspective. There is also the domestic politics here in Europe that is really important. Emmanuel Macron, yes, he and Olaf Scholz did meet, but Emmanuel Macron is possibly weaker than he has been since he was elected president of France. And Olaf Scholz, this time next month, is actually the German election, and probably he will not be the chancellor of Germany at that point. So there is this domestic politics of weakness to some degree from a lot of what have been traditional European power centers. And also, I think there is understandably something of a reassessment of what Trump's policies will be. I think the consensus among kind of Europe, which has higher levels of support for arming and defending Ukraine than the United States does, according to polling, has been that Trump will strong arm Zelensky into a unfavorable deal, and that may still potentially be the case. Nothing has happened yet, but his early comments critical of Russia this week, potentially threatening further sanctions, have indicated that it is perhaps not as straightforward as had been perhaps simplistically portrayed of Trump policy towards Ukraine. And then finally, just, I'm sure Catherine will have more to say about London in particular as we get to it. But, I think the sort of British diplomats and officials I've talked to, I think Britain, I don't know whether this is misplaced or not, but is quietly confident that its relationship with the United States is, on stable footing. The Foreign Office advisors I talked to say that, they think they were quite prescient in getting David Lammy a meeting with J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference last year, well before he'd been tapped to be the vice presidential nominee. And so they think that actually they have the strong foundations of the relationship. And so what, the day-to-day of Trump's various actions, I think Britain is fairly confident that they'll weather any potential threats, as was the case in his first term. But, this could change in 30 minutes, could change next week. We'll just have to wait and see.
A lot here, Prashant. I think that's right. I think what it just demonstrates is the complete uncertainty that Catherine, that European leaders and everyone is facing. It also, I think, demonstrates that they are stuck in the framework where you expect the United States to be a friend and an ally, which is, by the way, what the United States has been since December 7, 1941, for most of the countries, and just don't think it's possible for the United States actually to say, no, actually, we really don't care about you guys. We only care about ourselves, and it's not really clear how they're playing that. How do you see it, Catherine? Both the people you talk to in London and in Europe, but also sort of how they're dealing with this onslaught of change. You're muted, Catherine.
It's interesting. There's a different view from London, and there's a view from Brussels, and then there's a view from all the different European capitals. And this is one of the issues. I think Brussels was late getting its game together on essentially setting up a department of coping with the prospect of Trump, which they did almost a year ago. And they've mostly focused on the issue of tariffs and how they would respond to that. But I think that really what this Trump presidency requires of Brussels is something that it's not traditionally good at, and that is nimbleness, being ready for what comes, because of course it's Trump's unpredictability that makes him such a, testing ally as well as an adversary. I think for Europe, there is obviously there's great strains both within Europe and within some of the great powers in Europe, in France and Germany, their domestic politics. I think what's going to be very interesting is whether Trump seeks to exploit divisions within the EU itself and tries to pick off countries and treat them differently. We've already seen that in his threats towards Denmark over Greenland, that he might specifically try and target Denmark. Now, technically, with tariffs, that's not possible. The EU is a bloc. Trump doesn't play by the rules. So, whether he chooses to look at the EU as a bloc, or whether he thinks, well, actually, I'd rather deal with, Orban and Meloni, and then I might do this with Germany and France. So I think there's a lot of questions there. I think I'm familiar with the narrative, Prashant. laid out there over the official British position, the Foreign Office position of quiet confidence of their relationship with the Trumps. But in fact, I travelled in May to Washington with David Lammy before he became Foreign Secretary, and he was having a series of these sort of Trump whispering meetings, and he's gone on to have more of those. And, you know, he got Keir Starmer to Mar-a-Lago, and they had dinner with Trump. So that's there. I think their confidence is much overplayed. I think that it's useful for them to believe in that and to hope it's true and sort of make that a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I think actually that London is caught in a extremely difficult situation now, far more difficult than ever, really, given that its relationship with Europe is still not certain, even after Labour coming into power and taking a very different attitude towards Europe than the Conservative Party did. There's still considerable nerves amongst the administration here about how they approach this. I mean, even right now, we've got a political tussle going on about the notion that Britain could join a different kind of customs union with the rest of Europe, and Labour I personally think that in their heart of hearts, they would think that that was a solution, but they simply cannot bring themselves to reopen this absolute, this toxic debate over Brexit that has poisoned politics in Britain for, almost a decade now. So I think there's, different feelings in both places, but I would say that trepidation overall would characterize the feeling of the continent as a whole towards what happens next.
That's great, and I think you're the quiet people in the Foreign Office and elsewhere hoping that this will turn out all right. I hope they're also spending some time thinking about if it doesn't and what they do then, because if you get stuck with your own rhetoric and your own beliefs, that usually gets you nowhere. Ken, we'll get to Asia in a minute, but I want to get your perspective on sort of how do you think the Europeans have reacted on the front end, and perhaps also comment on Ukraine and how you see Trump as playing Ukraine, and his statement, a very strong statement that Putin needed to do a deal yesterday that he put on Truth Social, which I guess we now will have to follow again, although maybe not, because it does get reported in other places as well. And how to read that? In Europe, it's read as, well, if he's anti-Russian, he must be pro-Ukrainian. I'm not sure that's the way to read it necessarily, but how do you see it?
Right. So it was really interesting to see how Prashant and Catherine explained the confidence in Europe, or the hope in Europe, about dealing with Trump. I think from Japan and Asia's standpoint, the thing we have more advantageous than Europe is geography, the fact that we're closer to China. And somebody said that the Trump administration is like a coalition government. There's 4 factions, especially when it comes to China. There's the MAGA crowd, very anti-China. There's the defense crowd, who want to prevent China from having an edge. There's the tech titans. This is a very unclear what they want from China. And then there's the Wall Street people who want engagement with China. What I can say about all 4 factions is they're not interested in Ukraine. On the Middle East, maybe. But when it comes to China, I think 2 of those factions, the MAGA crowd and the defense crowd, want a very tough stance on China. The tech titans and the Wall Street, maybe not so much. So compared to Europe's confidence, I think Japan is confident in that these 2 factions are at least focused on China. And when it comes to China, Japan's geography cannot be changed. So I think that's a little sense of comfort. When it comes to Ukraine, former Prime Minister Kishida famously said what happens in Ukraine could happen in East Asia tomorrow. And that's why Japan has been supporting Ukraine indirectly. But I think Japan sees this as a test case of how Trump will deal with world affairs and how that will impact his decision down the road on Taiwan when it comes to funding or when it comes to committing U.S. troops, or the logic of why he would support Ukraine or why he would not support Ukraine, and how that would apply to Taiwan as well.
Yeah, no, I think that those linkages are certainly there in the Asian mind and many other minds. And I just, Prashant, just to stick for 1 second still to Ukraine. How do you read his statement yesterday? Is this a statement that Europeans are saying, "Oh my God, he's actually going to be okay because he's going to be on our side. He's tough on Russia," or is this a statement that says, "No, he really wants a deal, and it doesn't matter what the deal is, he just wants a deal"?
Yeah, I think Catherine's takeaway is, I think, the correct one we should anchor ourselves to, which is that we should differentiate between different administrations, different governments across this continent, because, I think the Ukrainians, polling suggests they were pretty fed up with the Biden administration by the end of it, and the sort of lack of unequivocal support. And so they are, it seems, pretty open-minded, again, polling indicates, towards the Trump administration. And, when you talk to senior Ukrainian military officials, that seems to be kind of confirmed. I think it varies across the continent. There is this still residual feeling that, he's a deal maker. And so what he says today may be different from what he says tomorrow. But this is not, to some degree, that, I don't want to say surprising, because I'm sure, Ivo, you were in many of these conversations before, which sort of forecast this might be Trump's way about it, that he doesn't, along with, famously wanting to make a deal, he also does not want to seem weak. And forcing an American ally to capitulate to Russia would have been sort of widely interpreted as weakness. And so I think there is some quiet, again, I think Catherine was exactly right in that this is probably overplayed confidence, but to some degree, there's a quiet degree of confidence that Trump may be more on side than was initially expected when it comes to Ukraine. That being said, there were countless examples during the first Trump administration in which the policy sort of flipped and, minor deals were trumpeted as enormous victories. And all of these things sort of came about this way. So we should be cautious. And I think that, again, I do entirely agree with what Catherine said, which is, I think that optimism is somewhat misplaced.
Catherine, you're a close observer of Ukraine, and I think Prashant is right on how the Ukrainians are both viewed. The end of the Biden administration, certainly the Trump administration, and Zelensky is making that very clear. But should they be confident that Trump's going to do the right thing?
Well, I was in Ukraine last on election day itself, and I think the reactions were surprisingly nuanced in some ways from Ukrainians because of what Prashant says about this becoming fed up of the Biden administration. And there were people in Ukraine who were horrified by the prospect of a Trump administration and believed he would sell them out. And there were others who just thought, there's such a logjam that maybe he could break it. And Biden isn't coming up to scratch either. I read Trump's outburst as a sort of I read it with some nerves. I read it firstly as a sort of outburst of impatience that we're used to, and especially the sort of inspecificity of it, where he goes, "We'll slam you with taxes, tariffs and sanctions, Russia." It's like, well, hold on. Well, for one thing, look at tariffs. What effect are they going to have? How much, what is the value of Russia's trade with the US under the current sanctions regime? It's tiny. This is not enough to press it. So I saw that as an expression of impatience, and if you're going to be pessimistic about it, the sort of nervousness of the fact that he wants to do a deal, and that's more important to him than anything. I agree with Prashant as well on the issue that he doesn't want to look weak or look a loser. So it's not the sense that he would sell out necessarily, But that impatience and the the monetization of it, the transactional nature of in which he phrased that, I will do this to you, Russia, unless you do a deal. He is talking again in sort of these are almost cash tangibles. This is again transactional diplomacy at its rawest. And the problem is that Ukraine does not have a lot to give in that. And what Ukraine is seeking is does not fit that transactional model very well for them. They need some sort of security guarantee. They can agree to give away, at least temporarily, the territory that Russia now has control of. I can see them doing that. I think they will have to. The question for Ukraine is about the survival of the rest of the country, about that rump of Ukraine. Can it survive on its own with a future, or is it just waiting out the time until Russia is in a position to come back and take the rest? Now, guarantees given by Donald Trump do not have the value of guarantees given by other administrations. So there will be a great deal of concern in Ukraine about what it is that they are promised. But as I see it at the moment, Trump is talking in pure transaction, and it is hard to see how that favors Ukraine, particularly because Ukraine is dependent on, at the moment, even if Europe were somehow to try and backfill for it, it is dependent on Washington's largesse in terms of military aid. And so in transactional terms, that's something Trump could equally pull from Ukraine, as well as use pressure to punish Russia.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and I think his interest in a deal for a deal's sake also suggests that he actually doesn't care what the outcome is, because he doesn't see this outcome in the same existential terms that the Ukrainians, or frankly most Europeans, see it, or even the Biden administration saw it, although we can debate how much it did. For him, it's just the issue is a deal, not a question of defeating Russia or saving Ukraine. It's the end of the war that he said would never have happened if he'd been president, and if he ends it, he demonstrates that that's in fact the case, or at least in his own mind.
And on an ego-driven level, which of course is the other critical issue to consider with Trump, he'd love a Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes.
And he has two opportunities for one: Ukraine and the Middle East, which is easier.
And we'll get to the Middle East in a minute, but before that, Ken, let's talk about the Asian reaction. In some way, it was business as usual, with the Secretary of State meeting with his three Quad counterparts the day after inauguration and the day after he was sworn in, and yet it isn't quite business as usual, is it?
Right. So I think that I want to say 3 points about how Asia sees the new Trump administration. I'll go quickly through the 3 first. One is that it's a fundamental departure from a values-based foreign policy. Trump has absolutely no sense of duty to defend the rules-based international order. So that's very important for Japan. 2, he probably wants a deal with China, and that probably leads to a kind of G2 setting of the world, which Beijing wants and Trump is okay with. So we have to adapt to that. And 3, Japan is not looking just at the 4 years of Trump. It's looking at the potential 8 years of J.D. Vance. So Japan is formulating a 12-year strategy. And I will get to that later, but that's because Japan doesn't see the Democrats coming back anytime soon. So going back to the first one, about the rules-based international order, I have a friend in the Japanese embassy, a minister, who's very famous for reading lots of books, a book a day, 300 books a year. And I asked him, what are you reading these days? And he said, the one I like really is called Realpolitik, a History, and it's written by a London historian called John Bew. But I found it interesting because for the last 10 years, since Shinzo Abe became prime minister for the second time, Japan's foreign policy has been circled on defending the rules-based international order. And it was not realpolitik, but I found that the fact that this diplomat is reading Realpolitik kind of symbolizes the change the crossroads Japan is at. Abe's rules-based international order, the focus on these international rules was kind of setting the rules of engagement with China. It wasn't realpolitik. It wasn't like equal distance between Japan and China. Abe knew that was dangerous. Instead, he said, if China agrees to play by these rules, we can deal with China. We can have a relationship with China. If China doesn't obey these rules, then we have to stick with America and force or lay the conditions that China would have to abide by the rules. And if Trump doesn't fit into this framework, Japan has to go back to the drawing board and recalibrate all of its strategy. So that's number one. Number two, on China, as you said, on the first day of the administration, the second day, the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting took place. Rubio arrived at the State Department, and then within an hour, he was holding this Quad Foreign Ministers meeting. So it was a good signal to Japan. They issued a joint statement, the first joint statement of the Trump second term. And in it, he said all the right things, that the Quad is committed to a free and open Indo-Pacific, rules-based territorial integrity, and we oppose using force to change the status quo. But everybody knows, well, all diplomats know that is probably not what Trump is thinking. Trump has talked about having a long phone call with Xi Jinping just before the inauguration. He made no specific announcements on tariffs on day one. So it looks like he will try to go for a deal. What's dangerous about that is that it would lead to a G2. And if you listen to Mike Waltz, what he has said in terms of what kind of deal he wants with China, he wants China to stop purchasing Iranian oil, because if Iran doesn't have the money, it won't be able to support Hezbollah, it won't be able to support Hamas. So with one stone, the Trump administration can hit all four. It would have a stable relationship with China. It would disrupt the activities of Hamas and Hezbollah, and also weaken Iran. The danger of that is, what is China's asking price for such a deal? And it could be very small things like changing the language on Taiwan. Right now, America does not support independence of Taiwan. Beijing might say, could you tone it up a little bit and say you actually oppose independence, do not support, but oppose Taiwan independence. And Trump might say, all right, what's the difference? We'll do that. But that is an irreversible concession. And the danger is to make irreversible concessions on Taiwan for reversible, very reversible concessions like oil trade. So that's what Japan is watching out. The third part, I think, which is the most important, Japan is preparing for a 12-year Republican rule of Trump and Vance. And really what is interesting, what Japan is totally focused on is J.D. Vance and Don Jr. and Tucker Carlson, these core people that would, if there is a Vance administration, these people will be at the core of that, and their foreign policy is very restrained. They don't want to commit to any overseas wars, endless wars that isn't directly connected to national security, and Japan is not confident that Taiwan would be directly related to American national interest.
That's a great overview, Ken, of sort of Japanese thinking, and it makes a lot of sense. The interesting thing is, I don't think I've ever heard a European overview that is that strategic in its considerations, which is a good thing. On the other hand, I'm not sure that the outcome for Japan is any better than it is for Europe in some ways. I mean, Prashant, I take Ken's. To take whatever you want to say, but I think it's interesting that the first and the second point are actually sort of interrelated. I mean, Trump he's made very clear he doesn't like the rules-based order. Indeed, I was struck that Rubio said in his confirmation hearing that the post-war global order is obsolete because it has been weaponized against us. That's a very strong statement, because that's the post-war global order, is the one that we created and have heralded. But the second issue is Trump interested in the G2? Is he interested in a way to rule the world together with China, or is he actually more interested in letting the Chinese do whatever they want to do in their own region, and the U.S. In return being able to do whatever it wants in its own region. How do you look at it?
Hey, first off, I'm still reeling from my Goodreads target for the year was 40 books, so 365 makes me feel incredibly small from this Japanese minister that Ken is friends with. That's positively terrifying. I think one of the interesting things, if you sort of take this down the line, and really like John Bu's book is kind of fascinating, this idea that there is that the thing that sort of defines us is the law of the jungle, right? I mean, that there is power can be exercised in this way, and it is in parallel terms, kind of fascinating. The Bu was an advisor to Boris Johnson, who was so often, he was the sort of chief foreign policy advisor to the British Prime Minister at the time. And, that is very much kind of, in some ways, like a sort of animating theory that Johnson always had as well, to some degree. And so, yeah, I think like one of the things when you talk about, does he want to rule the world with China? I think actually when you think back and look at the various ways Trump won was comported, Trump seems to deal best in bilateral settings and not multilateral settings. He is a relentless bilateralist, right? Whether it was the sort of, Shinzo Abe kind of meetings, or it was the Kim Jong-un meetings, or it was the litany of other things that happened. And, if we were to reduce kind of Trump one to a series of images, one that's pertinent to my mind is when he met with a bunch of sort of European leaders and shoved one to the side as he sort of walked to the front in that kind of video that sort of gets endlessly replayed. And I think so. It's not so much that I think I see Trump as wanting to rule the world with China or giving China its own sphere of influence. I think he is unafraid to just deal with China in bilateral terms. And that, if we were to contrast it with the Biden administration, which really tried to create, that kind of classic American network and lattice of alliances, right, through the Quad and building, the nuclear security agreement with sort of South Korea and AUKUS and all the various other things. I just don't think that's how Trump views the world. And if we go back to this question of transactionalism, it's not so much that he views, I think, China as an equal. I just think he views all relations in bilateral terms, and not in kind of creating this network, as Anthony Blinken would often say, this network of alliances that sort of amplifies American power. I just don't think he agrees with that sentiment. And so it's not to disagree with your point. I think it's just a slight sort of yes and of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And Catherine rightly, I think, also emphasized the transactionalism of Trump, and part of the transactionalism is that you're only interested in a deal and you don't look at how that deal will influence the next deal. It's like buying a building, and you bought the building, and then maybe someday you will sell it, maybe you won't, but you go on to do the next deal. Is that how we should think about it, as opposed to some grand strategic? Maybe we want to be more grand strategic, but Trump just wants deals, and that's why he is transactional and bilateral.
Yeah, I mean,
applies to China.
I think probably all of us spent, I certainly spent 4 years of the last Trump administration being badgered by editors for pieces on the Trump doctrine and the strategy and all these things that really didn't exist. And I think that John Bolton may have put this best, that, it's less of a doctrine or a policy than a sort of firing of synapses and reactions to things. And, there's not an overarching strategy to this. I think when it comes to China in particular, something Ken mentioned about the different groupings within the administration is interesting. About, the tech bros are going to take a very different take on this to the MAGA guys and, the traditional China hawks. But again, with China, there's the issue, there's the strategic stuff, which has to be addressed one way or another, because China has its own strategic ambitions. And then there's the trade war, which could, these things could stay separate or become very tied up in a very complicated way. I don't see China I can see China using a bilateral relationship with Trump to get the best outcome for itself from the US, from its relations with the US. I don't see Beijing getting suckered into the idea of a sort of G2 or that as being an overarching strategic partnership of any kind. It has that partnership with Russia. It will be interesting to see how that China-Russia partnership plays into how Trump is able to deal with China. Can he break that partnership? Does he have to? Can he just pretend it doesn't exist? I mean, we're already hearing of approaches being made to China by the Trump administration in how it might be used to influence Russia in getting this Ukraine deal, which, of course, Trump wants. So, there's so many different dimensions to this. And lastly, I would just say that it's very, very clear that Trump is not interested in multilateral institutions, but China is, and China has had a strategy for many years now of attempting to capture these multilateral institutions, get its people at the top of it. So, for example, you've had Trump just pull out of WHO, pull out of the climate accords. These are all places where China sees the absence or the retreat of American influence as an opportunity. And it's an opportunity for it to lead the world, not for it to lead the world with the US. Much better that if you're in Beijing, than Washington stepping aside, pulling back, isolating, and you filling the gap. I mean, China cares about its relationships with very, very small states just because of what that can do for it in multilateral institutions, where votes can go in the UN General Assembly. The amount of effort that China puts into relationships with the tiny states like the Solomon Islands or the Maldives, simply because when it comes to the General Assembly, it is one state, one vote.
Yeah, no, I think Catherine, that is a really important observation. And Ken, I'll give you one to come back, particularly on this G2 issue, because it seems to me, I understand why Japan may fear that, but it seems to me that whereas China has a very clear strategy, and it is actually looking at what it's trying to do with Trump as a means to implement that strategy, and it's actually getting some significant benefits, particularly as Catherine mentioned in the multilateral institutions, and frankly gaining votes. That's rather different than having a condominium of two big powers trying to rule the world together. It's one who's has a strategy. I don't want to make deals, and it strikes me that the thing I would be worried about if I were in Japan or indeed in Europe and indeed in the United States, the Chinese may beat us at the game because they're much better at it than we are.
All right. So I don't know if this is a direct answer, but part of the reason why Japan thinks in a 12-year time frame is because Japan isn't confident that the Democrats have a alternative to this deal-making transition Trumpism. The Republicans, I think, after the Iraq War, the disaster of the Iraq War, kind of abandoned this neoconservative view of Democrats spreading democracy and freedom and changing regimes in the Middle East so that they would be more pro-US, pro-Israel. They rejected that, and they came up with an completely different mindset, which is America first. And I think there's been a consolidation of that. On the Democrat side, it's not clear, as exemplified by the Nippon Steel deal, if the Democrats are for alliances and partnership and defending the rules-based international order, or are they still with the unions? Are they America first? Allies and partnerships, except for when it comes to steel. So,
for unions generally, I think it would be the argument.
Yeah. So I think, I'm saying this with the hope that the Democrats come up with a path that is more aligned with the rules-based international order.
No. I think that's a good point. Prashant, you want to jump in for quickly?
Yeah, I just think we should be a little cautious. I think you're right to say that China has a strategy and the United States perhaps doesn't. But, the last time Trump was in power, it wasn't clear that China's strategy was the right one. Its wolf warrior diplomacy was extremely costly across the Asia-Pacific region. Its relations with Australia went to an all-time low and have only recently recovered. This is not simply I think we can too often fall into the trap that, it's a dictatorship, so they can always, steer the course and be wise and not have to adhere to election cycles. The sort of downside of that is that they don't course correct as quickly because there aren't elections to course correct from. And, the evidence from the sort of last sort of 8 to 10 years is actually, in a lot of places, relations with China have notably worsened. And in the Trump administration, for all its transactionalism, it was hyper focused on China in a way that and the sort of threat from China. Perhaps the rhetoric was too aggressive. We can argue about that, but there was this kind of focus on the country that had not necessarily been taken to that into that level before, and that has since become consensus. And so I would just be a little just recalibrating that this idea that because China has a strategy, it is necessarily ahead of the game. The last time that this happened, its strategy was poor, or certainly not, universally victorious.
I think that's a very good observation, and indeed, last week when we were talking about Trump and Biden administration on China, Jamil Anderlini made exactly your point too, which is that the change in U.S. perspective came under Trump, and it was an important change and a necessary adjustment to what China represented, and the strategy actually was pretty good. So and you're right that the Chinese scored a lot of own goals with their World War diplomacy and other places, for sure. Catherine, I don't want to lose with the other big issue and big piece of news, which is the Gaza ceasefire, which has now been in effect for 6 days, and the situation on the ground has fundamentally changed in a positive sense. There are no more bombings, there are no more shootings. The Israelis have drawn back, and aid is flowing in massive numbers. In fact, I think in 2 days, as much as sometimes in 2 days of aid, as much as in a month's time before that. And yet, there is this sense that this is just an interregnum from one phase of the war to the next. How do you see it, and where do you think we are today and likely to move?
Well, we're both officially and de facto in phase one of a process that's been set up in phases, which is doesn't have a great history in the Middle East in peace processes. That this is how they've lots of attempts to solve the larger issue of the Israelis and the Palestinians have faltered on there being a process at which each stage was the opportunity for failure was built in. We'll remember we constantly refer to Oslo and the Oslo Peace Accords. That was meant to be a phase, and it became a status quo that has ground on and brought misery to frankly everyone concerned. So each new phase of this ceasefire deal, as it exists now, requires new negotiations, and that's the problem. Number one, the structural problem. Number two are the facts on the ground and the domestic politics of Israel. Netanyahu was more or less bullied into this deal by Trump. Everything seems to come back to Trump right now. But I thought it was very interesting that when Trump was asked on day one whether he believed the ceasefire would last, he said that he didn't have great hope and said, "Oh, it's not our war, it's their war." And so it came across that I immediately thought, oh, this is something he wanted. It was a bauble that he wanted for inauguration day. And how much does he actually care about how it is going forward? So Netanyahu lost two ministers, two coalition partners because of this deal, because it is opposed by the far right. He will lose another, Smotrich, if he goes ahead, if he doesn't resume the war in March. And Smotrich has spoken out, that's the finance minister. Smotrich has spoken out very openly and publicly about this promise that Netanyahu has given him that war will resume in March, and that if it does not, he will leave the coalition, and that will collapse the government or leave it absolutely paralyzed. So it's all sort of hanging on that. Now, At the same time, we've seen the Israeli security forces launch an offensive in the West Bank. I think we're seeing against Hamas and its partners in the West Bank. I think we're seeing this for several reasons. One is that support for Hamas is rising in the West Bank. Partly because of the Palestinian disenchantment with the Palestinian Authority, corrupt, useless stooges, etc. Partly because they have been able to sort of take Hamas's propaganda of its hit on Israel. It's easier for them to take because they haven't had to suffer quite the same consequences as those in Gaza who are living in the ruins of it. So, it's easier to adulate Hamas when you're not having to live with the direct consequences of it. Interestingly, Smotrich, this minister who's threatening to leave, he is the de facto governor of the West Bank, and he wishes to annex it. That is something that the far right in Israel think they might be able to get out of Trump, permission to annex the entire West Bank. So I would say that all these things are fairly carefully calibrated at the moment, and that people like Smotrich are looking at this operation in West Bank as proof of Netanyahu, who's promised that he has not thrown the towel in and won't give up on that part of his coalition.
Yeah, I think that's I think that is the dilemma, and I wonder, Prashant, on the one hand, Trump is modulating already the idea that there would be a second phase. On the other hand, he's made pretty clear, one, that the deal was because of him, so it's his deal now, and second, that he wants all the hostages released. And of course, what Hamas cleverly did was to make sure that not all the hostages will be released in phase one, that in fact there is a second phase when other hostages, including Americans, potentially might be held until phase two, and phase three, of course, is when those who are no longer alive would be released. So there is this question of whether Trump and Netanyahu are set for a collision course, where Netanyahu wants to get out of the deal because I think Catherine rightly says the domestic politics, but Trump wants the deal because it's his deal.
Yeah, I think Catherine's summary was exactly right. I mean, I would just say one of the interesting differences, though, between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is the political pressure on Trump is very different to that on Biden. And it's just the Palestinian American voting bloc that was, very sort of understandably frustrated with the Democrats over sort of support for Israel. That this is not as significant a voting bloc for Republicans. And so the politics for Trump, whether or not it is his deal, I think it's just a little. The sort of polling impact of it, I think, will be slightly different because I suspect Republicans will not lose seats over this the way Democrats might have. And so, yes, it will be sort of that. But I think broadly you're right that this is eventually the interests of Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu do not neatly coincide, particularly because, as Catherine correctly, exactly rightly noted, 2 and possibly 3 ministers resign, and he has a precarious coalition, even if long-term voting patterns are in his favor. And so this really feels like, the president kind of summed it up. Is anybody really confident that we'll get through 3 phases of a ceasefire, given the sort of history of this conflict and the sort of past 15 months? I certainly am not.
Well, the good news is that we will be discussing it here on World Review to see whether or not it won't happen or not. This has been a fascinating discussion. Prashant Rao of Semaphore, Catherine Philp of the London Times, and Ken Moriyasu of Nikkei Asia. Thanks to all 3 of you for your insight and perspectives. Greatly appreciate it. Thanks for all of you who are watching and listening in. Do so again. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.